We have looked at the IEA, International Energy Agency reports before. This one is for 2022, summarizing where we are, especially in light of the Ukrainian war or Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how the energy crisis created by that has been affecting Europe. I have made some comments before about how the reliance on coal is actually still not completely gone, even in the most progressive of these European countries, because when there's a crisis of gas supply from Russia, the winter is upon us, then people begin to reach for whatever is available. I wanted to include this report especially because the IEA is very upbeat about where renewables are headed and how the projections for 2027 have been revised from 2021 to 2022, with a tagline that actually the war has accelerated the transition, European transition to renewables. This would be good news that while there may be some quick response to reach to coal and biomass for tiding through the winter in the absence of Russian gas supply, maybe that's also driven a transition to renewable as much faster than what the trajectory was before the war. So let's just look at some numbers to see what the projections are. So these are the upward revisions to renewable capacity expansion forecasts from renewables 2021 to renewables 2022. We are looking here in terms of percentages forecast revision from 2021. So China's renewable forecast has been upped to over 35% compared to 2021. EU almost 35%, global at over 25%, maybe up to 27 or so percent. US projection is increased to almost 25%, and India stands at under 10% in terms of the upward revision compared to 2021. So overall, you can take this as good news, but remember again that these are projections. So renewable capacity, so just read the number: renewable capacity expansion forecasts. Okay, renewable capacity growth in the main and accelerated cases. So the two scenarios considered. Accelerated cases come of course from what's happening in response to all the geopolitical perturbations due to war, and of course pandemic is part of the story before the war started. 2010 to 2027, so longer term perspective here. 2022 to 2027 net zero by 2050 scenario, what would be needed. So in terms of gigawatts, we are up here somewhere over 3,700 gigawatts or so in terms of where we want to be if we want to hit net zero goals by the 2050 scenario that I have put in a podcast somewhere else, again from the International Energy Agency scenarios. In the accelerated case, the 2022 to 2027, China has to be here at 1,100 or 200 gigawatts, and advanced economies have to add up to over 2,000, so almost, let's say, 2,300 gigawatts or so, and then other emerging and developing economies have to add a tiny bit, but will still be short of what we would want by 22-27 in terms of what is required for net zero by 2050. 2022 to 27 main case, so that's the slower transitions to renewables and expansion of capacities. You can see China's numbers drop, the rest developing countries, advanced economies drop, and the rest of the world, developing economies and emerging economies drop as well. So we drop quite a bit here from about 2,900 gigawatts to about maybe 2,400 gigawatts. That's let's say 500 gigawatts, which is what India promises, for example, to go by 2030 in terms of renewables under their revised NDCs. 2016 to 2021 projections were much lower, and 2010 to 2015 were even lower than that. So you can see this acceleration definitely as a very encouraging sign that the world is beginning to see that we cannot continue to rely on fossil fuels, and the renewable capacity has to keep growing. So that's reality. And of course, now the question is how pandemics and other geopolitical perturbations will affect the deployments of renewable capacities across the rich countries, poor countries, and China. Okay, so here in terms of renewable capacity growth outside of China, in the main and accelerated cases for 2010 to 2027, China, of course, dominates. We'll also look at the production of solar panels, for example, where China dominates the market right now. And this could play either way, depending on whether China would like to use that as a way to gain growth in economy, or whether it'll try to use that as a leverage to, let's say, suppress competition in the region or globally, especially since there is always some discussion of relations between US and China, for example, which cascades into relations of China with other regions of the world like the EU. And of course there's always the geopolitical issue between China and India, and in the region in general between Pakistan, India, and China, and so on. So all this cannot be ignored. Nonetheless, looking at gigawatts, we are again looking at different periods: 2010, 2015, 2016, 21, 2022 to 27 projections with the main case and the accelerated case. There are details on how these are done. You can go and look them up. It's a long report. Obviously I'm giving a very brief summary of it here, just to make one point about how renewables will look like by 27, let's say, compared to coal. One of the taglines in headlines based on this report have been that coal is going to be much less important by 27 compared to solar and renewables. So that would be good news as well. So European Union, 2010 to 2015, and of course 2022-27 main case and accelerated case, so brings the numbers up nicely to almost 450 gigawatts for the US, remains lower at under 350 gigawatts in the accelerated case. India, so good news is other than the European Union, everybody has expanded their portfolio of renewables in the period of 2010 to 2015 and 2016 to 2021. So India is still a smaller country, smaller deployment of renewable capacity, still relying on coal for the next decade or two, and so on. So it comes in the accelerated case by 27 at just over 200 gigawatts. Brazil is even lower than that, so you can see it's well under 100 gigawatts in the accelerated case by 27. Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, ASEAN countries, and other countries together. Depending on you're an optimist or a pessimist, you can take this as good news or as not being fast enough for the net zero goals and the global warming targets and so on. I tend to be an optimist, and that everybody is at the table negotiating and pushing forward on renewables, EVs, and other things, reducing emissions. Okay, the entire issue of decarbonizing the system, of course, is something that nobody's on yet. So reducing emissions versus decarbonizing systemic changes can make a big difference, as well as we have discussed in a couple of podcasts on the carbon trap, carbon fractals, and so on. Coming now to global electricity generation by technology during 2015, 21, and 27. So you can see 15, 21, and 27, role of oil, nuclear, natural gas, renewables, and coal. So coal drops by 27, but again, the pessimistic view would be that this is not enough of a drop, but we'll see that projections look good in terms of the renewables surpassing coal, and natural gas remains almost the same, maybe reduced a tiny bit. Oil remains almost well, reduces a little bit. Nuclear is still in the portfolio here, even though there are lots of issues in terms of safety concerns, Germany not wanting to do nuclear, for example, and so on and so forth. Okay, but renewables jump very nicely going from 2015 to 2021. We already had increased in terms of the percentages. Here it's, let's say, about 23%. Here it's larger, maybe 26-27%, and it's going to go up much larger, let's say 30 to 70, so almost 40% by 27 in these projections. Global increase in renewable energy consumption and share of total heat demand in buildings and industry over 2010 to 2027. So we are coming through the historical period to projections in all these things. So you can look at 2010 to 15, 16, 21, 22, 27 outlook, and this is the net zero emission where we need to be. So look at renewable electricity, solar thermal, and renewable district heat, which works for some regions, most regions of the mid-latitudes, but some regions of the tropics as well, or at least countries like India in the northern part where district heat can still play a big role. So this is, of course, share of modern renewables at period end. So you can see here in terms of percentages versus exajoules, so where we need to be by 27 for the net zero emissions versus what the outlooks are, and so on. So again, the projections for 2022 to 27 is down here at just over 3 exajoules, whereas for the net zero we need to be way up here, more than almost 27% of the energy production or renewable energy consumption and share of total demand, heat demand in buildings, but where we are or where we will be in terms of the outlook. And this is for the industry, similar numbers. So here you can see that for the net zero emissions from the industry, in terms of modern use of bioenergy, geothermal, and share of modern renewables at the period end, so 27 in terms of the percentages versus exajoules. You can see that the black dot is in a different place here. So share of the modern renewables is doing better in terms of the net zero emission targets here. But we have also looked at the transparency, credibility reporting of the emissions and net zero trajectories by the industry, and none of them get very high score in terms of credibility, reliability, transparency, and so on. So we have to be, of course, careful about the outlooks and looking at the historical period and what is happening right now. Coming to the end, we have to look at solar PV manufacturing capacity outside China and total investments by 5-year periods over 2017 to 2027. The diamonds here are investments in the previous 5 years. So you can see the projections as well as the history. As I said, this is of course something that everybody has to worry about, just in terms of the supply chain remaining sustained and somewhat independent of China, so that whatever way China wants to use its capacity to affect the supply chain, global supply of PVs and deployment of renewables, it's good to look at. So 2017, these are APAC, India, Europe, North America, and rest of the world. And you can see in 2017, rest of the world didn't have much, but 2022, it's looking somewhat better, and investments in the previous 5 years remain here. So 2022 here is already a projection, of course, because we're still only in December as the report comes out. And APAC is Asia Pacific region, excluding India and China, in case we are not aware of this already. By 2027, the polysilicon, in terms of the low and high projections, wafers, cells, and modules, you can see how the numbers are looking in terms of projections out to 2027 in the low and high scenarios in terms of solar PV manufacturing capacity outside China. So rest of the world will begin to pick up in terms of PV manufacturing capacity, which of course in terms of life cycle analysis also reduces transportation cost and overall carbon emissions from deploying renewables themselves. Remember that we talked about the embedded emissions in the transitions themselves. So you want to worry about the rate of transition to renewables as well as the embedded emissions in deploying them. So this is a good scenario in terms of manufacturing as close to deployment as possible and not always importing from China, in addition to making sure that we are insulating the supply chain issues by not relying entirely on China. So that's a very brief summary of the Renewable 2022 scenario, except I might have left out one figure that I wanted to show in terms of coal. So let me get that and complete this podcast. Okay, hold on a second. So sorry about this. This is the key figure that I actually somehow didn't include. So this shows the cumulative power cumulative power capacity by technology 2010-2017 in gigawatts. So we have solar PV, wind, hydropower, bioenergy, coal, and natural gas. So what's the good news? I just wanted to point out in terms of projections, coal is expected to flatten out, keeping in mind, of course, what happened with Russian war. And we have to wait for the numbers to see how the coal consumption got affected by the war and the perturbations to the gas supply to Europe and so on. And natural gas is still there. It's not flattening out as much as coal in this projection. For example, hydropower going up, wind going up nicely, but the projection says solar PV is expected to go up so much that eventually it'll cross the coal power capacity in terms of coal plants by just before 2017. So you can see that this difference here is not massive, but it's a good optimistic message nonetheless, keeping in mind, of course, that any small perturbation could change this dynamic here at the end. So let's hope for some world peace and continued deployment of solar PV with increased PV manufacturing capacities outside China, making this even faster and more reliable in terms of projections for 2027. Okay, so I'll leave that there. This is the main message I also wanted to include at the end. Sorry for the disturbance in the middle. Okay.